Hey guys, tonight we're going to set sail for the cold, rugged lands of the north. To a time of longships, sagas, and fierce warriors, we often picture Vikings as lawless raiders, living by the sword. But beneath that wild image, there was a complex, if often brutal, system of justice. Tonight, we're going to discover how Viking justice was brutal, and I mean truly brutal. We're talking about a level of public shaming, physical violence, and societal exclusion that, frankly, you probably wouldn't survive a single season of. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported to a windswept clearing in Viking Age Scandinavia, perhaps in Iceland or Norway, around 950 CE. A natural amphitheater of rocks, or a specially designated field, serves as the meeting place. This is no ordinary gathering. This is the thing justice in the open air. It's the local assembly, the heart of Viking law and governance, where disputes were settled, laws were made, and justice, in its rawest form, was dispensed. Imagine hundreds, perhaps thousands of free men, farmers, chieftains, merchants, and warriors, gathering. The air is crisp, filled with the murmur of voices, the occasional bray of a horse, and the distant cries of ravens. There are no grand courthouses, no robed judges, no professional lawyers as we know them. Instead, a circle of prominent men, often local chieftains, godar, or respected elders, form the law council Legreta. They are the interpreters of custom, the guardians of the law, but they are also part of the community, subject to its pressures and expectations. The thing operated on principles of oral law. There were no written law codes in the early Viking Age. Instead, laws were memorized and recited by a designated law speaker, skogarmaðr. Imagine a wise old man, standing atop a prominent rock lugberg, or law rock, his voice resonating across the assembly, reciting ancient precedents and legal traditions from memory. This oral tradition made law incredibly accessible, but also susceptible to interpretation and dispute. It meant that justice was rooted in communal memory and shared understanding, not a distant written code. Disputes brought before the thing could range from petty theft and insults to serious crimes like assault, murder, and land disputes. The process was often chaotic, noisy, and deeply personal. Unlike modern courts, where a judge or jury weighs evidence impartially, the thing was a public forum where plaintiffs and defendants presented their own cases, often through a designated speaker. You'd stand before the assembly, articulating your grievance or defending your actions, your reputation and your family's honor on the line. The goal of Viking justice was not primarily punishment in the sense of imprisonment, but rather reconciliation and maintaining social order. Imprisonment was rare and usually temporary. The focus was on settling disputes to prevent the escalation of blood feuds, a terrifying cycle of revenge that could decimate families and destabilize entire communities. Instead of imprisonment, the primary forms of redress were fines bought and, for serious offenses, outlawry. For most crimes, a price was set for every injury, every insult, and every life. We'll delve deeper into Vergild later, but for now, understand that justice often came down to a negotiation of payment. If the accused could pay the fine, the matter was settled. If not, the consequences were dire. The thing also served as a social gathering. It was a place for trade, for arranging marriages, for exchanging news, and for athletic contests. Amidst the serious legal proceedings, you'd see people bartering goods, young men engaging in wrestling matches, and old friends catching up. This blend of law and social life made the thing a central, inescapable part of Viking existence. The pressure of public opinion was immense. Your standing in the community, your family's reputation, and your honor were constantly on display. The assembly, composed of your neighbors and peers, judged your character as much as your actions. This public scrutiny, this constant awareness that everyone knew your business, was a powerful force in shaping behavior. It was a chaotic but surprisingly democratic system where the voices of free men held significant weight. So, as you envision the fierce Vikings, remember that their society was not a lawless free-for-all. Instead, it was governed by a unique system of justice, raw and public, embodied by the thing justice in the open air. It was a place of legal debate, social gathering, and profound consequences, ensuring that order, however brutal, was maintained in the Viking lands. It makes you feel pretty grateful for clear courtrooms and private deliberations, doesn't it? You've stood in the open air thing, witnessing the chaotic public nature of Viking justice. But how was guilt or innocence actually determined in a society without forensic science, detailed investigations, or even widespread literacy? The answer often lay in trial by oath-sworn words. Fateful ends. Truth was often decided not by objective evidence, but by the weight of sworn testimonies and a community's willingness to believe. Imagine a dispute brought before the thing. Perhaps your cow has been stolen, or your neighbor accuses you of damaging his property. You, the plaintiff, would present your case, recounting your version of events. The accused would then present his... There were no cross-examinations in the modern sense, no lawyers to pick apart testimonies. It was often a direct exchange, a battle of words and reputations. The core of the trial rested on the concept of oath-swearing. In a society deeply rooted in honor and the power of divine retribution, an oath sworn on sacred objects like a ring, a spear, or a hallowed stone, or in the name of the Norse gods. Thor. Odin. Tyr was considered extremely binding. To break such an oath was not only a grave social transgression, but also an offense against the gods, believed to bring divine punishment. You'd stand before the assembly, raising your hand, swearing to the truth of your words, your fate hanging on the solemnity of your oath. However, it wasn't just your word against theirs. The system relied heavily on oath helpers Eidbrenner. If you were the accused, you would need a certain number of free, respectable men, typically 6, 9, or 12, depending on the severity of the crime from your community to swear an oath on your behalf. These men didn't have to witness the crime. They simply had to swear that they believed your oath of innocence to be true, effectively vouching for your character and credibility. Imagine having to gather a dozen of your peers, all free men with their own reputations, to publicly declare their belief in your honesty. Their willingness to do so was a powerful indicator of your standing in the community. This system highlights a crucial aspect of Viking Age society. Reputation and social standing were paramount. If you were a respected member of the community, known for your honesty and adherence to custom, it would be easier to find oath helpers. If you had a history of deceit or your family was disreputable, finding enough men to vouch for you would be incredibly difficult, almost impossible. This meant that justice was often intertwined with social perception, a testament to the power of community judgment. While specific numbers of oath helpers varied by region and the nature of the accusation, the fundamental principle of compurgation, clearing oneself by oath of others, was widespread across Germanic law, of which Viking law was a part. The consequences of failing to secure enough oath helpers, or of being unable to take an oath yourself if you were too ill, for example, or had lost your good name, were dire. It was considered an admission of guilt. You would then be subject to the penalties prescribed by law, typically a fine vorgild or, for grave offenses, outlawry. There was no concept of innocent until proven guilty in the modern sense. If you couldn't prove your innocence through oaths, you were considered guilty by default. Consider the psychological pressure of such a trial. You stood before your entire community, your friends, neighbors, and rivals, knowing that your very future depended on their belief in your integrity. The atmosphere was charged with tension, every word, every gesture, and scrutinized. It was a terrifying public performance where your standing in the community was literally on the line. This reliance on sworn oaths also meant that actual evidence like weapons, footprints, or eyewitness accounts played a secondary role. While such evidence might be presented and discussed, it was the oaths, the solemn declarations of truth and belief, that ultimately carried the decisive weight. This is a stark contrast to modern legal systems, which prioritize forensic evidence and verifiable facts. For the Vikings, truth was often a matter of public consensus and honor, backed by the implicit threat of divine wrath. The system was also susceptible to manipulation. A powerful chieftain or a wealthy individual might be able to coerce or influence oath helpers, making it harder for a poorer, less influential person to achieve justice. The idea that might makes right was never far from the surface, even within the structured framework of the thing. So, as you observe a Viking trial, remember that it was a deeply personal, public, and often terrifying affair. Justice was meted out not by impartial judges and objective evidence, but by the weight of sworn words and the collective judgment of the community. For the accused, it was a test of reputation, a gamble on the honor of others, with truly fateful ends awaiting those whose oaths were deemed insufficient. It makes you feel pretty grateful for forensic labs and impartial juries, doesn't it? You've navigated the chaotic public thing and the terrifying implications of trial by oath. But for the accused who failed to clear their name, or for those who committed the gravest offenses against society, a chilling punishment awaited outlawry, a fate worse than death. To be declared an outlaw in Viking Age society was to be stripped of your very humanity, cast out from all protection, and left to the mercy of a brutal world. Imagine standing before the assembled thing. The law speaker's voice booming across the clearing as your verdict is read. You are found guilty of a grievous crime, perhaps murder without proper weregild blood money paid, or a heinous act against the community. Or perhaps you simply couldn't find enough oath helpers to vouch for you. The verdict is not imprisonment, nor is it immediate execution. Instead, the terrifying word rings out. You are declared an outlaw skogarmaðr, forest man, or bush dweller. This declaration was a legal and social death sentence. It meant you were stripped of all your rights and protections under the law. You no longer had any legal standing. You could not own property, participate in the thing, or appeal to any authority for justice. Your oaths were worthless, your testimony unheard. You became, in essence, a non-person. But the horror didn't end there. To be an outlaw meant you were fair game. Any free person could kill you with impunity. There was no penalty for taking an outlaw's life. In fact, some might even see it as a civic duty to eliminate such a threat to social order. Imagine walking through the wilderness, or even just attempting to steal a morsel of food, knowing that every stranger you encountered, every farmer whose land you crossed had the legal right to kill you on sight, and might even be eager to do so for a perceived slight or simply to remove a dangerous element from their world. You were literally hunted, with no refuge, no one to mourn your passing. Your family also suffered immense consequences. While they were not necessarily made outlaws themselves, they would be shunned. All their property could be confiscated, leaving them destitute. They would be denied the usual social support of the community, ostracized for their association with an outlaw. Imagine your wife and children cast out, struggling to survive, forever marked by your disgrace. This added a profound emotional burden to your already desperate situation. Outlawry effectively forced you into a life of constant flight and hiding. You would have to abandon your home, your land, and your family, fleeing into the vast, untamed wilderness. You'd become a lone wolf, surviving on your wits, foraging for food, sheltering in caves or crude makeshift hovels. The elements would become your relentless adversaries. The biting cold of winter, the scorching heat of summer, the constant threat of starvation. Wild animals posed a danger, but humans, with their legal right to kill you, were an even greater one. There were two main types of outlawry. Minor outlawry, skogarmaðr. This was a temporary banishment, typically for 3 years. often for lesser offenses or when a fine could not be paid. While still brutal, it offered a slim chance of return if you survived and could clear your name or pay your dues upon your return. Imagine enduring 3 years of this hell, clinging to the faint hope of regaining your life. Full outlawry skogarmaðr. This was a permanent, irrevocable banishment, often for murder or other grave crimes. There was no return. Your life was effectively over, condemned to live as a hunted beast until you either perished in the wilderness or were killed by another free person. This was considered the ultimate punishment, a fate truly worse than death, as it denied you a proper burial, a place in Valhalla, and a legacy among your kin. Your very memory could be erased from the community's narratives. The threat of outlawry was a powerful deterrent, a core mechanism for enforcing order in a society without prisons or a centralized police force. It placed the burden of enforcement directly on the community, making every free person a potential agent of justice against the outcast. It was a brutal system, but effective in maintaining social cohesion through fear. Historians still debate the frequency of full outlawry versus temporary banishment. Though the concept was a central punitive tool across most Norse legal systems, the psychological toll of being an outlaw was immense. You were utterly alone, abandoned by society, haunted by the knowledge that your life was worthless in the eyes of the law. The constant paranoia, the never-ending fear of discovery, and the profound sense of isolation would surely drive many to madness or despair. Your existence was a continuous, desperate struggle for mere survival, without hope, without comfort, and without human connection. So, as you reflect on Viking justice, remember that its most terrifying punishment wasn't a dungeon or a quick execution. It was outlawry, a fate worse than death. It was the complete erasure of your identity, the stripping away of your rights, and a condemnation to a solitary, hunted existence, where every sunrise brought the chilling reality that you were fair game for anyone, anywhere. It makes you profoundly grateful for witness protection programs and the right to a fair trial, doesn't it? You've stood condemned as an outlaw, understanding the horrifying implications of being cast out from society. But even within the accepted framework of Viking law, a deeply unsettling system could emerge when disputes arose between families, blood feud, cycle of vengeance. This was a brutal reality where justice wasn't administered by a central authority, but often by the relentless escalating violence between kin groups, turning perceived slights into generations-long sagas of retribution. Imagine a scene that could ignite such a feud. Perhaps a free farmer accidentally kills a neighbor's son during a hunting accident, or a property dispute escalates into a fatal brawl. In a society without a powerful centralized government or police force, and with limited concept of state-administered punishment, the burden of seeking justice, or vengeance fell squarely on the injured family. The kin, the core principle was honor hedr. An injury or death to a family member was not just a personal loss, it was a profound insult to the honor of the entire kin group. To allow such an act to go unpunished or uncompensated was a sign of weakness, inviting further aggression and diminishing the family's standing in the community. This created an intense social pressure to seek retribution. Initially, efforts might be made to resolve the dispute peacefully at the thing. The accused might offer compensation virgild, or man price for the deceased or injured individual. We'll delve deeper into virgild later, but for now, understand that if the compensation was accepted, the matter could be settled, and the feud averted. However, if the kin felt the offer was insufficient, or if the insult to their honor was too great to be bought with money, they had the right to seek direct vengeance. This is where the cycle of violence began. If the virgild was rejected, the injured kin had the legal and customary right to kill the perpetrator. This was not considered murder under Viking law. It was considered justified killing drap, an act of lawful vengeance. Imagine you, a member of the aggrieved family, setting out to hunt down the man who killed your brother or wronged your kin, knowing that society sanctioned your quest for retribution. But here's where the cycle truly began. The moment you killed the perpetrator, his kin now had a grievance. They, in turn, had the right to seek vengeance against your family. This could escalate rapidly. A single death could lead to a chain of retaliatory killings, involving not just the immediate parties, but brothers, cousins, and even distant relatives, all drawn into the escalating spiral of violence. Imagine living in a constant state of alert, knowing that a relative's past actions could suddenly bring a bloodthirsty enemy to your doorstep. You might wake up to the sounds of a raid, not from a foreign land, but from a family in the next valley, seeking their heffend. While sagas vividly depict the drama of blood feuds, historians still debate their exact prevalence and how often they were successfully mediated by things or by the payment of vergild, noting that outright, prolonged feuds were often destabilizing to communities. This system of personalized justice meant there was no real peace, even if a dispute was formally settled at the thing. Lingering resentments and a sense of unfulfilled honor could lead to secret assassinations or ambushes years later. Grudges could be passed down through generations, making entire families hereditary enemies. You might inherit a feud, the sworn enemy of a family whose past grievance was so old. Its origins were almost forgotten, yet the obligation for vengeance remained. The law speaker and the godar at the thing would constantly try to mediate these feuds, to convince families to accept vergild and cease the cycle of violence. They understood that unchecked feuds could lead to the breakdown of social order. However, their power was primarily persuasive. They could not truly force a family to abandon their right to vengeance if their honor was at stake. The ultimate decision rested with the aggrieved kin. The emotional toll of living under the constant threat of a blood feud was immense. You'd live with a pervasive sense of anxiety, always on guard, always weighing your words and actions, knowing that a careless insult or a minor transgression could spark a deadly chain reaction. It fostered a culture of vigilance, suspicion, and a chilling readiness for violence, even within one's own community. For those caught in the middle, perhaps marrying into a family with an ongoing feud, life was even more precarious. You could be drawn into a conflict that had nothing to do with you. Simply by virtue of your new family ties, your loyalty would be tested, and your life might be forfeit for the actions of others. So, as you reflect on Viking justice, remember that it was often a brutal, decentralized system, where the pursuit of honor and the right to vengeance could lead to relentless violence. The blood feud was not just a legal custom, it was a devastating reality that turned entire communities into battlegrounds, trapping families in a terrifying cycle of vengeance from which there was often no escape but death. It truly makes you appreciate our modern legal system, where the state handles retribution, doesn't it? Doesn't. You've explored the terrifying consequences of the blood feud, where vengeance could spiral into endless violence. But what about when disputes were actually resolved without bloodshed? Or when a crime wasn't deemed worthy of outright vengeance in Viking justice? Most crimes, even murder, often came down to a negotiation of monetary compensation. Vergild, the price of a life. This system, while seemingly cold to modern eyes, was a crucial mechanism for maintaining fragile peace in a society without prisons. Imagine a dispute at the thing, perhaps a physical altercation that resulted in a serious injury, or even an accidental death. In a modern court, you'd expect a trial followed by a prison sentence. In Viking Age society, imprisonment was almost non-existent as a form of punishment. There were no state-run prisons, no infrastructure to hold large numbers of offenders. Instead, the focus was on compensation to the injured party or the family of the deceased, designed to avert a blood feud and restore balance to the community. This compensation was known as vergild mannbót in Old Norse, literally man compensation. It was a fixed price placed on every person's life, every injury, and every insult. This wasn't a subjective assessment. It was determined by established legal custom, often based on the social status of the victim. Imagine a detailed, unwritten price list for every part of the human body. Every limb, every tooth, every bruise. A lost eye would have a set price, a broken arm another, and a murdered free man of very specific high value. For murder, the Vergild was the most significant. This man price had to be paid by the perpetrator or, crucially, by his kin group to the family of the victim. The idea was that taking a life created a debt to the kin, a debt that could be paid in silver, gold, land, or valuable goods. If this payment was accepted by the aggrieved family, it legally ended their right to seek vengeance, preventing the blood feud from spiraling out of control. Imagine the tension as the victim's family considered the offer, weighing the price of their lost loved one against the peace that the payment could bring. Sometimes, despite the value, the insult was too great, and they would demand blood. The specific amount of Vergild varied based on several factors. Social status. The Vergild for a free farmer bond was higher than for a thrall-enslaved person, but lower than for a powerful chieftain jarl. A slave having no legal standing had virtually no Vergild, their death being a property loss to their owner, not a personal one. This highlights the inherent inequality in Viking justice, where the value of a life was directly tied to one's social standing. Severity of injury. For non-fatal injuries, Vergild was calculated based on the specific body part or function lost. A hand was worth more than a finger, an eye more than an ear. It was a remarkably precise, if morbid, system. Context of the crime. Was it accidental or intentional? Was it committed in self-defense? These factors could influence the final amount or whether Vergild was even applicable. The responsibility for paying Vergild rested not just on the individual perpetrator, but on his kin group. This was a fundamental aspect of Viking society. The family was a collective unit, responsible for the actions of its members. If a son committed a crime, his father, brothers, and even more distant relatives might be expected to contribute to the Vergild payment. This shared burden encouraged kin to exert social pressure on their members, to behave lawfully and to mediate disputes to avoid crippling financial penalties. Imagine your entire family having to pool their meager resources for years to pay off a Vergild debt incurred by a reckless cousin. While sagas describe Vergild as a clear payment, historical evidence suggests its calculation and negotiation could be incredibly complex, often involving prolonged legal wrangling at the thing. As outlined in early law codes like the Grágás of Iceland, the payment of Vergild often served as a pragmatic solution to avoid endless cycles of violence. It provided a socially acceptable alternative to direct retribution, allowing communities to restore a semblance of peace. Without prisons, Vergild was the primary means of formal punishment and conflict resolution. It placed a tangible economic cost on violence, forcing families to weigh the price of revenge against the financial ruin of their kin. However, the system was not without its flaws. It favored the wealthy, who could more easily pay large Vergilds, potentially escaping harsher consequences for their actions. For a poor farmer, even a minor Vergild could be ruinous, potentially forcing him into debt slavery. It also required the aggrieved party to accept the Vergild. If they refused, the blood feud could still be pursued. So, as you reflect on Viking justice, remember that its core principle for most crimes was not about incarceration, but about calculated compensation. Vergild, the price of a life, was a brutal yet practical system, aiming to buy peace and prevent endless cycles of vengeance through financial payments. It was a stark reflection of a society where life had a quantifiable price, and justice was often measured in silver and land, not in years spent behind bars. It truly makes you appreciate the concept of a state-run justice system with impartial judgments, doesn't it? You've navigated the brutal realities of Vergild, where life had a price. But what happened when negotiation failed? Or when a crime was so grievous that blood money simply wasn't enough for the Vikings? There was a final, deadly arbiter of justice holmgang, trial by combat. This wasn't a metaphor, it was a legally sanctioned duel to the death, a brutal and theatrical way to settle disputes when all other avenues had failed. Imagine a situation that could lead to a holmgang. Perhaps a man has publicly insulted another's honor, a grievous offense in Viking society. or there's an intractable land dispute that the thing cannot resolve through oaths or fines, perhaps a serious crime, like rape or particularly heinous murder, demands a more visceral form of retribution. When all other legal and social avenues were exhausted, and one party felt their honor demanded satisfaction, they could formally challenge their opponent to a duel. The holmgang was not a spontaneous brawl. It was a highly formalized and ritualized event, almost a legal proceeding in itself, designed to prevent uncontrolled blood feuds from erupting. It typically took place on a small, isolated island holmvægir or a specially designated patch of ground, often marked out by stones or ropes, signifying its sacred and legal nature. This separation from the main community ensured that the duel wouldn't immediately devolve into a chaotic mass brawl involving kin groups. The rules, though varying by region and period, were generally strict. Both participants would bring their chosen weapons, typically a sword, an axe, or a shield. They would often be limited in the number of blows they could exchange, or the number of shields they could use before having to retreat. A cloak, or a piece of cloth, might be laid on the ground, and fighting was restricted to that area. If you stepped outside the boundaries, you could forfeit the duel. Imagine the tension, the silence, broken only by the clang of metal and the grunts of the combatants, as the entire community watched, knowing one of these men would not walk away. The most crucial rule and the very essence of its brutality was that the holmgang was usually a fight to the death, or at least until one participant was unable to continue fighting and conceded defeat, which was considered a profound humiliation. There was no concept of a safe duel. The intent was to inflict serious harm, to prove your rightness and your bravery through physical dominance. The defeated party would not only suffer grievous injury or death, but would also face public disgrace, and often forfeiture of their property. Imagine stepping onto that designated spot, knowing that your life and your honor were literally on the line, with no second chances. Witnesses, often including the Godar chieftains or other respected community members, would be present to ensure that the rules were followed. This oversight, rudimentary as it was, gave the duel its legal legitimacy. They would proclaim the victor and ensure the outcome was accepted by both kin groups, hopefully preventing further vengeance. While specific details on holmgang are primarily drawn from Icelandic sagas, which can be exaggerated, their legal existence and general characteristics are supported by early Norse law codes, though historians still debate their exact frequency and how often they were truly fought to the death versus a decisive injury. The holmgang was an incredibly risky proposition, even for a skilled warrior. One misstep, one lucky blow, could spell your end. You might face an opponent stronger, faster, or simply luckier than you, regardless of the justice of your cause. This wasn't a trial of truth in the modern sense. It was a trial of physical prowess and martial honor. The gods, it was believed, would favor the righteous, but the immediate reality was the skill of your hand and the strength of your arm. This practice highlights the Viking emphasis on honor and self-redress. In a society without strong centralized authority, individuals and their kin were expected to defend their own honor. The holmgang provided a formalized, albeit deadly, avenue for this, allowing grievances to be settled outside the endless cycle of blood feud, but still through a direct, violent confrontation. It was a brutal way to achieve a final resolution, an ultimate form of arbitration. The psychological toll of anticipating and then participating in a holmgang must have been immense. The sleepless nights leading up to the duel, the chilling calm before the first strike, the visceral reality of fighting for your life, knowing your very existence could end with a single blow. It's a terrifying prospect, even if you emerged victorious. The memory of taking another man's life in such a personal, brutal way would surely linger. So, as you reflect on Viking justice, remember that sometimes the only way to prove your point, to defend your honor, or to right a perceived wrong, was through the deadly embrace of combat. The holmgang, trial by combat, was a chilling testament to the brutal, unrefined nature of Viking law. a final, bloody arbiter in a world where personal might often trumped abstract legal principles. It truly makes you appreciate courtroom dramas, doesn't it? You've explored the deadly holmgang, where disputes were settled by the sword, but for the Vikings, proving guilt or innocence sometimes involved an even more terrifying and seemingly irrational method, trial by ordeal. Divine judgment's cruelty. These were ancient, often agonizing, tests, believed to invoke the direct intervention of the gods or a higher power to reveal the truth when human testimony faltered. Imagine you are accused of a crime, perhaps a serious theft or perjury, and the evidence is inconclusive. Or perhaps your oath helpers are unwilling to vouch for your innocence. In such desperate circumstances, a chieftain or the thing might order you to undergo an ordeal. This wasn't a punishment, but a supposed test of truth, a direct appeal to the divine, where your fate literally lay in the hands of a higher power, and the excruciating limits of your physical endurance. One of the most common and terrifying forms was the ordeal by hot iron. Imagine yourself standing before the assembled community, your heart pounding with terror. A piece of iron, often a plowshare or a simple bar, would be heated red hot over a roaring fire. Your task would be to carry this searing hot iron a specified distance, perhaps 9 paces. Imagine the excruciating pain as the superheated metal sears your flesh, the smell of burning skin filling the air, your muscles screaming in protest. After carrying it, your hand would be bound and sealed. After 3 days, the bandage would be removed. If the wound was clean and showed signs of healing, you were declared innocent, blessed by divine intervention. If it festered or showed no signs of healing, you were deemed guilty. While the precise methods and prevalence varied by region and period, historical texts from the early medieval period in Norse and Germanic societies document the use of hot iron and water ordeals as legal instruments, albeit with skepticism from some later Christian writers. Another terrifying method was the ordeal by boiling water. Imagine a large cauldron of water brought to a furious boil. Your task would be to reach your hand into the scalding water to retrieve a small stone or ring from the bottom. The pain would be instantaneous and unimaginable, your skin blistering and tearing away. Similar to the hot iron, your hand would then be bandaged, and its condition after a few days would determine your guilt or innocence. The logic was that a truly innocent person, favored by the gods, would be miraculously spared severe injury, or heal miraculously quickly. In reality, it was a test of luck, constitution, and sometimes the skill or corruption of the person administering the ordeal. There were other, less common ordeals. Ordeal by cold water. The accused would be thrown into a body of water. If they sank, they were considered innocent as the pure water accepted them. If they floated, they were guilty as the water rejected them, often due to perceived sorcery or grave sin. This was particularly dangerous in cold Nordic waters, making it an almost guaranteed death sentence. Ordeal by morsel. The accused would attempt to swallow a piece of consecrated bread or cheese. If they choked or struggled to swallow, they were deemed guilty. This preyed on the psychological stress of the accused, as fear alone could cause difficulty in swallowing. The sheer cruelty of these ordeals is horrifying to modern sensibilities. They inflicted immense suffering and often permanent injury, or death, regardless of actual guilt or innocence. A truly innocent person could be condemned to agonizing pain or death simply because their body reacted naturally to extreme heat or cold. There was no scientific understanding of wound healing or the effects of burns. The outcome was seen as a direct manifestation of divine will, an unquestionable judgment from above. The purpose of these ordeals was not to find evidence in our modern sense. Instead, they served several functions in a society without complex investigative techniques. Divine intervention. They provided a mechanism for obtaining truth when human testimony was insufficient, appealing directly to the gods to reveal the guilty. Social cohesion. They offered a definitive, undeniable in the eyes of the community resolution to intractable disputes, preventing blood feuds or lingering resentments. Once the ordeal had spoken, the matter was considered settled, sanctioned by the divine. Deterrence. The sheer terror of undergoing an ordeal likely deterred many from committing crimes or lying, knowing the agonizing test that awaited them. The ordeal was a public spectacle, performed before the assembled community at the thing. The fear in the air would be palpable, a mixture of dread and morbid fascination. You'd watch knowing that the accused's fate was about to be decided not by logic, but by the raw, brutal application of heat or cold. So, as you reflect on Viking justice, remember that beyond the thing and the holmgang, there was a deeper, more chilling form of truth-seeking. Trial by ordeal, divine judgment's cruelty, was a terrifying testament to a belief system where human suffering was seen as a pathway to divine revelation, and justice was a brutal gamble with your very body and soul. It truly makes you appreciate fingerprints and DNA evidence, doesn't it? You face the terrifying prospect of trial by ordeal, where divine judgment meant searing pain. But even when a verdict was delivered, Viking justice often had a long and chilling reach, fueled by deep-seated personal and familial grievances, vengeance's cold grip, long memory, brutal justice. Grudges could span generations, ensuring that retribution, for the Vikings, was often a slow but relentless pursuit that few could escape. Imagine a wrong committed, perhaps a perceived insult to your family's honor, a betrayal, or even a past killing that was never fully compensated or avenged. In a society where honor was paramount and a centralized state apparatus was weak, the concept of vengeance was not just a right, but often a social obligation. This wasn't about quick, impulsive acts. It was about a calculated, often cold and patient, pursuit of retribution that could define entire family histories. Viking society had an incredibly long memory for grievances. Insults or injuries could be passed down from father to son, becoming a hereditary obligation. A man might grow up hearing tales of how his grandfather was wronged by a rival family, and he would carry that burden of unavenged honor into his adulthood. The sagas are replete with examples of feuds that span decades, involving multiple generations, where the original cause might even become a hazy memory. But the thirst for retribution remains sharp. Imagine being born into a family with a centuries-old feud, knowing that at any moment, the actions of your ancestors could lead to a deadly encounter with a family you barely knew. This long memory meant that justice was often a slow, relentless pursuit. There was no statute of limitations for serious offenses. A person who committed a crime and escaped, or paid an insufficient regild, might live for years, even decades, thinking they were safe. But the aggrieved kin would not forget. They would wait for the right opportunity, perhaps when the perpetrator was traveling alone, or when his family's support was weak, or when a change in political power shifted the balance. Vengeance could be a cold, calculated act, planned with meticulous detail, executed without mercy. The methods of retribution were often brutal and personal. Unlike state-administered justice, which can be impersonal, Viking vengeance was often direct and visceral. If you were the target, you might face a sudden ambush, a knife in the dark, or a calculated attack on your isolated farmstead. The intent was not just to kill, but often to send a clear message, to restore honor through a display of strength and resolve. The sagas describe acts of gruesome mutilation, public humiliations, and deliberate terror, all designed to satisfy the aggrieved party's sense of justice and to prevent future transgressions. While sagas, being literary works, might sensationalize violence, the underlying principle of personal vengeance and its brutal manifestations are corroborated by early law codes and historical context. The concept of outlawry, as we discussed, was also a tool of this long-term vengeance. If a perpetrator was declared an outlaw, anyone could kill them with impunity. This meant that the aggrieved kin could pursue them relentlessly, hunting them across the land until the score was settled. Imagine living your entire life as a fugitive, always looking over your shoulder, knowing that a relentless, unforgiving enemy was patiently waiting for their moment. This system of personalized vengeance created a pervasive atmosphere of distrust and anxiety. You had to be constantly vigilant, wary of strangers, and even cautious of neighbors. Grudges could simmer for years, hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. This made social interactions complex, where every word, every gesture could be misinterpreted or held against you. The bonds of community were strong, but they were constantly tested by the underlying threat of unresolved conflict. Even when a Vergild was paid and accepted, the memory of the transgression could linger. The peace was often fragile, a truce rather than a complete forgiveness. A future slight, a new dispute, could easily rekindle the old resentment, igniting the feud anew. This meant that justice was rarely truly final in the way we understand it. It was a continuous negotiation, a constant state of potential conflict. The relentless pursuit of vengeance also had a profound impact on family life. Children were raised with stories of familial grievances, inheriting not just property, but also enemies and the obligation for retribution. The legacy of vengeance could shape marital alliances, influence political decisions, and dictate the very paths of individual lives. Your family's safety and honor depended on your willingness to uphold these inherited obligations, to ensure that no wrong against your kin went unavenged. So, as you reflect on Viking justice, remember that it was often a deeply personal, unforgiving, and protracted affair. Vengeance's cold grip ensured that grievances were rarely forgotten, and that retribution, even years later, could be sudden and brutal. This long memory, brutal justice, was a stark testament to a society where honor was paramount, and the pursuit of retribution was a driving force, turning life into a relentless, often violent, saga of settling scores. It truly makes you appreciate an impartial court of appeal, doesn't it? You've witnessed the chilling reach of vengeance and the long memory of Viking justice. But there was another, equally brutal, consequence for those who fell afoul of the law or simply succumbed to misfortune slavery as punishment. Loss of freedom. For the Vikings, the ultimate loss of liberty, often stemming from debt, poverty, or specific crimes, was a grim reality that condemned individuals to a life of bondage. Imagine your life as a free Viking farmer. A bad harvest, a crippling illness, or an unforeseen accident could plunge your family into desperate poverty. You might borrow food or silver from a wealthier neighbor or chieftain, hoping to repay it. But if you fell into debt that you could not repay, you could, as a last resort, become a debt thrall bondi, being the free farmer. Thrall being the enslaved person. This meant that you, or a member of your family, often a child, a son or daughter, or even a wife, could be forced into servitude until the debt was paid. Imagine the profound humiliation and despair of losing your freedom, your social standing, and your very autonomy, all because of economic hardship. This was a direct consequence of a society with no social safety nets, where individual misfortune could lead directly to enslavement. Beyond debt, certain crimes could also lead to enslavement. While outlawry was common for severe offenses, for some crimes, or if a Virgild could not be paid, a free person might be enslaved as a form of punishment. This applied particularly to offenses that involved repeated transgressions, or were deemed to threaten the social order in a way that Wergild alone could not rectify. Imagine a petty thief, caught one too many times, finally being condemned to a life in chains. His future forfeit. While debt slavery was explicitly recognized and practiced, the direct enslavement as a legal punishment for crimes varied by regional law code and period, though the possibility existed, especially if a fine could not be paid. Turning the offender into a thrall as a form of compensation to the injured party or the state. Then there was the constant threat of capture through warfare or raiding. While this primarily affected non-Norse peoples who were captured and brought back as thralls, it could also happen to Vikings themselves if they were defeated in battle against rival Norse groups. If your village was raided by another chieftain, you could be taken captive and enslaved by your own countrymen. This was a stark reminder that even among supposedly free Vikings, the threat of bondage was ever present, a harsh reality of intergroup conflict. Once enslaved, you became a thrall. Your status was that of property, a chattel, with no legal rights. You could not own land, marry legally, testify in court, or make any independent decisions. Your life was entirely at the whim of your owner. You could be bought, sold, traded, or inherited, just like any other piece of property. Imagine the profound dehumanization of being treated as a possession, your personal history and humanity utterly disregarded. The work of a thrall was often arduous and unremitting. Many toiled in the fields, performing the most back-breaking agricultural labor. Others might work in the longhouse, performing domestic chores like grinding grain, cooking, cleaning, and caring for children. Still others might be forced into dangerous roles, like mining for iron, or working on construction projects for chieftains. The conditions depended largely on the benevolence of the owner, but there was no legal protection against cruelty or overwork. You'd work from dawn till dusk, every day, your body perpetually aching, your spirit slowly eroded by the relentless drudgery and lack of hope. The fear of physical punishment was omnipresent. A master could flog, beat, or even, in extreme cases, kill a thrall with little to no legal repercussion. Your life was cheap, expendable in the eyes of the law. You learned to obey unquestioningly, to anticipate your master's moods, and to endure silently. For resistance often meant further suffering. Children born to thrall mothers were automatically born into slavery, perpetuating the cycle of bondage. This meant that entire generations could live and die in chains, their fate predetermined by their mother's status, not by any act of their own. The legacy of slavery could span centuries, creating a class of people forever denied liberty. The psychological toll of living as a thrall was immense. The loss of freedom, the constant fear of arbitrary violence, the lack of personal autonomy, and the knowledge that your children would also be born into bondage, created a pervasive sense of despair. Your dreams would be haunted by the memory of freedom, or by the grim reality of your inescapable servitude. So, as you reflect on Viking justice and society, remember that for all its emphasis on free farmers and warriors, it also maintained a brutal system of human bondage. Slavery as punishment was a grim reality, condemning individuals to a life where their bodies were tools, their wills were broken, and their very humanity was denied. It truly makes you appreciate the fundamental right to liberty that we champion today, doesn't it? You've witnessed the brutal things, the terrifying ordeals, the endless blood feuds, and the grim reality of slavery as punishment. As we conclude our journey into Viking justice, let's reflect on a justice of violence and custom, how Viking law, far from being a chaotic free-for-all, was a complex system deeply rooted in communal pressure, honor, and a chilling reliance on physical retribution, leaving a legacy far removed from our modern ideals. Imagine standing on that windswept thing site one last time, observing the remnants of Viking law in action. What stands out is a system that was profoundly different from modern justice, yet surprisingly structured for its time. It was a justice system born of necessity in a society without strong centralized authority, prisons, or a professional police force. The primary legacy of Viking justice is its decentralized, community-driven nature. Justice wasn't imposed from above by a powerful state. It emerged from the collective will of free men, meeting at the thing. This meant that reputation, social standing, and the power of kin groups played an immense role. Your guilt or innocence could hinge on the willingness of your neighbors to vouch for you, or your family's ability to pay a fine. This fostered a strong sense of communal responsibility and accountability, but also meant that justice could be deeply influenced by local power dynamics. This leads to the second crucial aspect, the centrality of honor and vengeance. For the Vikings, a crime was not just an offense against the law, it was often a profound insult to a family's honor. The right to seek retribution, the blood feud, was a legally recognized pathway to justice, often only averted by the payment of vergeld. This emphasis on personal and familial vengeance ensured that justice was often brutal, protracted, and highly personal, leading to cycles of violence that could span generations. It's a chilling reminder that, for the Vikings, justice was often literally a score to be settled. The Viking legal system's fundamental reliance on physical retribution and financial compensation also defines its legacy. Imprisonment was rare. Instead, justice was dispensed through fines vergeld for most crimes, or through physical tests like the holmgang duel and ordeals by hot iron or boiling water, which inflicted severe physical pain or even death. For the most egregious offenses, or for those who couldn't pay, outlawry was the ultimate sentence, effectively condemning an individual to a hunted existence, open to be killed by anyone. This direct, often brutal, application of justice stands in stark contrast to modern concepts of rehabilitation or state-controlled punishment. While Viking law codes like the Icelandic Gragas provided complex frameworks for fines and procedures, the ultimate enforcement often relied on communal pressure and the threat of personal violence. The oral tradition of their law is another remarkable feature. Without widespread literacy, laws were memorized and recited by law speakers, making legal knowledge accessible but also fluid. This reliance on custom and memory, rather than written codes, highlights a unique approach to legal governance, where shared understanding and communal consensus were paramount. Finally, Viking justice presents a complex moral picture. On one hand, it was a system that valued the voice of free men, provided avenues for dispute resolution, and attempted to prevent endless chaos. On the other hand, it was deeply unequal, often brutal, and profoundly dehumanizing, particularly for women, thralls, enslaved individuals, and those who lacked powerful kin. It was a justice system that, in many ways, mirrored the harshness and directness of the Viking Age itself. So, as you reflect on the fierce independence and complex society of the Vikings, remember that their justice was not a gentle hand, but a firm, often brutal, grasp. It was a justice of violence and custom, where honor was paramount, vengeance was a right, and the law, for all its structure, was deeply rooted in the physical realities and social pressures of their untamed world. It makes you profoundly grateful for our modern, more humane, and centrally administered legal systems. Doesn't it? All right. As the last echoes of our journey through Viking justice fade into the quiet of the night, it's time to gently bring our minds back to the present. You've stood on the thing, witnessed the oaths, and grappled with the brutal realities of a world where justice was often a personal and violent affair. It's a powerful reminder that history, in its quietest corners, often reveals the most poignant truths about human societies and their evolving sense of right and wrong. Let the images of open-air meetings, death-defying oaths, and brutal revenge slowly fade away, giving way to the quiet peace that surrounds you. The smell of damp earth and the tense atmosphere of conflict fade, giving way to the familiar comfort of your own space. Let any lingering thoughts of inequality and harsh punishments gently drift away, replaced by a sense of relaxation and peaceful reflection. The struggles and justice of the Vikings of old are now, temporarily, part of your understanding, enriching your sense of history and the value of a more just, modern legal system. As your breathing deepens and your body relaxes, know that the stories of the past are always here, waiting patiently to be rediscovered, whenever you seek a gentle escape into the depths of time. But now, the journey is complete. Rest easy, knowing that another story has been revealed. Gently, just for you.